Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, How Personality Influences Virtual Teamwork. My name is Caitlin, and I'm an Associate Marketing Manager for the Myers Briggs Company. So I just want to take a minute and highlight the questions section really quickly. We're going to use this today kind of like a chat function. So just want to make sure everybody knows where it is. And if we're asking you to submit anything, tell us anything about how you're doing, that's where you're going to do it. So you can try it now if you'd like. Just drop us a note, say hi, tell us where you're from, and if you know your MBTI personality type, that would be great. And then also just how working from home, working remotely is going for you. So we have a lot to cover today, and we may not get to all the questions at the end, but if you submit questions throughout the presentation, we will definitely follow up with you afterwards. This webinar will be recorded, and we're going to be sending the slides and the recordings out in the next few days. So most of you know who we are, but in a nutshell, we're one of the world's largest business psychology providers. And this is our mission as the Myers Briggs Company, to inspire everyone to lead more successful and fulfilling lives. And I think this fits in really well with today's topic and the focus on how we can help virtual teams and how we can personally enhance our communication as a part of the virtual teams that we're in. So in general, we fulfill our mission by offering consultancy, certification, and other tools and resources that improve self-awareness and understanding. We work with organizations of all sizes to improve teamwork and collaboration, to develop effective leaders, and to solve their most complex people challenges. We're also a B Corp, and as a B Corp, our community is very important to us. And at this time, we really want to focus on helping businesses and ensuring that they don't lose momentum because of this unprecedented change that we're all facing. And we all know that very few people were prepared for this, so we want to offer our expertise and support where we can. So now I'm going to introduce our speaker. You may recognize Helen if you've ever done training in the UK. Helen also works in our thought leadership team, and she's completed this research as a part of her role there. So welcome, Helen, and I will hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. So it's a pleasure to be here today and to talk to you about virtual teams. So this webinar is based on a piece of research that I ran in 2019. 469 people worldwide took part, so thank you very much if you were one of them. So the survey asked people for their FIRO scores, if known, and if FIRO scores were unknown, then respondents completed the FIRO questionnaire. We also asked people for their MBTI type, if they knew it. And we asked people what kind of team they worked in. We explored the different facets of working in a team, what they felt were important characteristics of teams, and then finally the challenges that they found working in a team. Ultimately, what I was trying to see was if there are any personality differences between people who worked in virtual teams versus people who worked in physical ones. So what are we going to be covering today? Well, first of all, we will take a look at the kind of teams in which we work. There was an excellent article in our People First for Organisational Fitness report on the changing shape of teams. We know that most of you work in a mix of teams, but we were looking at the team or the teams you work in most or have to manage. We'll have a brief introduction to our FIRO and MBTI tools, but don't worry if you don't know a lot about them, because Caitlin is going to talk about it in human terms by sharing the experience of a colleague of ours, Eleanor. I'm going to then debrief that in relation to the 5 key scales of an effective team. Now, in the survey, we asked a number of questions, and based on the responses to those answers, we used a statistical technique called factor analysis, and from that, these scales emerged. So these scales are what we found from doing this piece of research. So we'll look at a number of different things, but the things that we will be mostly thinking about are how you can put in place things that suit different people. And we'll also touch on stress and how that can affect us and reduce our effectiveness. Our final point that we will cover is reviewing the findings from this research. So we'll put some context around what we learnt, about the research and also about working in virtual teams. But we're also going to look at who you are. So thank you very much for those of you that have responded to Caitlin in terms of telling us who you are, where you are, and if you know it, your MBTI type. So let's crack on with the show. Let us have a go at defining teams. So the first definition that we're working here with is a co-located team. And this is where everyone is physically present. So we'd say that everyone maybe works in the same building or they have frequent face-to-face contact with one another. In complete contrast to that, you've got virtual teams. Virtual teams, they're joined by a common purpose and they have an interdependent goal. So they rely on each other, but there's little to no physical presence with one another. Combined teams, these are a mixture of the two, and I would say that probably these are the most common, certainly where we work. So the Myers Briggs Company, we're a global company. I've never met Caitlin, who's hosting this webinar from our US office. I hosted this webinar yesterday for a European audience. Prior to our lockdown in the UK, I used to see my co-host every day. So our next step really is to find out about you and about your team, and in particular, what things were like before COVID-19. So it doesn't matter if you're a manager or part of a team, there might be some independent consultants on here. So we would like to ask you to pick the team that you mostly work with, even though it's probably usually a mix. And you can pick a combination, we don't mind. What we're keen to do is to find out what kinds of teams you worked in or you currently work in. So Caitlin, we've got this set up as a poll. So if we could please run this poll, we'll wait for a few moments and see the results coming in.
All right. Just going to give it a few more seconds.
Thank you.
Okay. So the poll results show that most people work in co-located teams. So they spend a lot of time in the physical workplace. And it actually echoes the results that you're going to share.
Oh, that's grand. Thank you, Caitlin. And thank you also for sharing where you are at as well. So our next step is to just cover some of the questions that we were asking before we carried out this research. So we were looking at what role does personality play, and are there personality differences between people who work in virtual teams? And at a really high level approach, broadly speaking, there were no core personality differences between the managers and the different types of teams that managers managed or the people who worked in those teams. So what we're taking from this really is that there's no one type of person who's better or more capable or who more frequently manages either co-located or virtual teams. And certainly from my reading, there's a perception that sometimes virtual teams need to be treated differently in some way. Virtual teams face very similar challenges to co-located or combined teams. The key point here really is to figuring out what adaptations might need to be made for the different types of teams. So that's not to say that working in a virtual team is not without its challenges. The challenges that they face are quite often very similar to more traditional teams. We might need to work a bit harder just at finding out what adaptations need to be made. So in terms of the team membership from the research that we carried out, we found out that 40% of the people who took our survey were members of a virtual team, 54% weren't. And then we also went on and we asked people, do you manage or do you lead a team? And again here, what we found was that 54% of people managed or led a team, that was a co-located team. 31% managed a combined team, so that's a combination of co-located and virtual teams, and then 15% of people managed a virtual team. What we'll do is go on and think about virtual managers and how their behaviours support their teams compared to co-located managers. Now, there were some differences. They were quite small, they were quite nuanced, and of course what we need to do, as always when there's any kind of research that we do, sometimes we end up with more questions than we do answers. There'll be some areas where I actually do think that we need to do some further research to really get beneath the surface and to understand more about some of the responses that we heard. But in terms of what we heard and what people report, there's a key indicator that there's something going on with virtual team managers and the way that they manage their teams. Now, last week, my colleague, Rachel Cubis-Wilkinson, she kindly presented a webinar on virtual team communication. I'd really encourage you to look this up in your own time. There's some great tips in there on how to work with virtual teams. So today we're going to be looking at two tools, FIRO and MBTI, and we'll be looking at these through the lens of working virtually. We're going to follow the journey of one person through this, and what we'll do is we will compare this against the 5 team scales that emerged as a result of our research. And right now we're hearing lots of people saying that this is a really sudden change that's being caused by COVID-19. It's stressful on both themselves and their teams. And we're going to look at how we can pinpoint this stress from amongst all of the different stress factors caused by COVID-19, and also think about different ways of managing this. So before we carry on, we're just going to touch on and look at the FIRO framework. So what does FIRO stand for to begin with? It stands for Fundamental, Interpersonal, Relations, Orientation. There are 3 interpersonal need areas: inclusion, involvement, the need to belong; influence, the need to control; and then finally, connection, the need for intimacy or one-to-one relationships. Now, you just heard me refer to involvement as inclusion, and that's because they are also sometimes known as inclusion, control, and affection. So just to recap, involvement is all about belonging and all about participation. This refers to how we relate to groups of people. Then influence, as I said, this relates to control and also responsibility. And then finally, connection. So this is all about our depth of relationships, and that relates to one-to-one relationships. So involvement is about groups, connection is about one-to-one relationships, and then influence is about one-to-one relationships and also groups as well. So you've got that groups and one-to-one piece. So we then dig a bit deeper into FIRO, and within the framework there are 2 types of behaviours. You've got expressed behaviours and wanted behaviours. So expressed behaviours, we say that these are the ones that you initiate towards other people. In other words, you express them. And then there's also wanted needs. So these are the behaviours that you use to receive from others. Sometimes our wanted needs aren't always as visible as our expressed needs. Moving on and looking at the scoring, for the purposes of this research, we used the FIRO business, and the way that this is scored is that you've got low, medium and high scores, and there are percentiles in terms of the way that these are scored. They run from the 0th or the 0 percentile or right the way through to the 100th percentile. And a little bit more about this scoring. So the scores show 2 things: how often the behaviour is used, so we call that frequency, and then how many people that we show it to, selectivity. Now, I just want to touch on the boundaries between these scores. The high, the medium and the low is just about helping us to simplify some of the scoring. But when it comes to FIRO, what this tells us is about interpersonal needs. And there's this idea that when it comes to these needs, we all have a set point, how much and how often we want our needs to be met. And when they're not met, what can happen is that we become uncomfortable, perhaps becoming more rigid and maybe less flexible in our behaviour too. And this particularly can happen during times of stress. And I know I speak from experience when I say that we can, or I can, dig my heels in. And so what we can do is we can use our understanding of interpersonal needs to help understand what might be going on. And today we're going to be concentrating on psychological needs. So sometimes people think that needs are, about making sure that if people are working remotely, for example, that they've got the right technology. But actually, for the purposes of this research, we were asking more about these psychological needs. Earlier, I mentioned that we will be following one person through in this presentation, and I'll let Caitlin introduce Eleanor and her scores now. Just one point about Eleanor. She's a real person, she's based in the UK, and that she's also given us permission for her to be used as a case study in this presentation. So Caitlin, over to you to explain Eleanor's profile to us.
Thank you. So these are Eleanor's FIRO scores, and I'm just going to tell you a bit about what she looks like when she's working in a physical office, as well as her experience with the sudden move to remote working. So Eleanor has a high expressed and high wanted need for involvement, a high expressed and a medium wanted for influence, and a medium expressed and wanted for connection. The involvement score means that she prefers to work with others, to network, and to bring other people on board with what she's doing. And when she's starting something new, you'll hear a lot from her. She has a lot to say. And Eleanor wants participation from other people, and she usually has a lot of projects going on at one time. So you'll also hear her debating ideas and exploring how she can persuade people to get on board with her type of thinking and her opinions. The connection scoring means that Eleanor has close relationships with some people and not with other people. So in other words, it's situational and context dependent on what you'll see. Eleanor likes to know what's going on around the office, finding alignment simply by being around other people. And her preference is to have formal meetings as well as informal meetings. And time has to be carved out for this, or she can go rogue and just do her own thing. So Eleanor is coping with the lockdown, but she's looking forward to going back to normal, whatever that might be in the future. And right now, her needs are being met by the increase in meetings and all of the informal connections that she has, which I'm sure a lot of us are also seeing. Dan, Eleanor's boss, doesn't need to worry about her as he is trying to make sure the whole team has what they need mentally and physically to stay sane. So where Eleanor could run into difficulties is that she can easily involve other people too much, forgetting that they may have other things that they need to be working on and other projects that are priorities. And so this is especially true when we look at her MBTI personality type, and more importantly in her stress reactions. So she can go off on a tangent when she's stressed, and I can outline how she can have too many ideas and is unable to come to closure on one idea. And her boss, Dan, can sometimes see her or overhear her talking about this multiple ideas, and he'll hear a passing comment in the kitchen, and he might just see Eleanor working late, and this is a cue for him to maybe check in with her.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Caitlin. That's a useful overview of Eleanor, who we will be following through in terms of just explaining and outlining just how we can see one person responding to working in a virtual team. Before we carry on though, what I want to do is just briefly outline the MBTI framework. I'm aware that there might be a number of you who are familiar with the framework, and some of you, you might be less familiar with it. So what we'll do is we'll just give you an overview of the 4 preference pairs, and then we'll carry on and we'll just hear a bit more about Eleanor's profile. So within the MBTI, that stands for the Myers Briggs Type Indicator. There are 4 preference pairs. The first one, extroversion and introversion, tells us about where people gain their energy from. Those with preferences for extroversion, well, they gain their energy from the outside world, and that often involves people and activity. Whereas those with preferences for introversion, they gain their energy from their internal world. So you'll often find them preferring calmer environments, and they gain their energy from just perhaps a smaller number of people. The next area, sensing and intuition. This tells us about the kind of information that people prefer to use. People with preferences for sensing, they prefer information that's factual and precise. They want to see the practical application of ideas. So if you're talking to someone with preferences for sensing, you might hear them ask, well, how will this work in practice? Whereas those with preferences for intuition, they're often drawn to the big picture, to ideas, to theories, to concepts, and to frameworks. And instead, you will hear them ask, well, what could be? The next preference pair, thinking and feeling, this tells us all about how people make decisions. In those with preferences for thinking, they're drawn to making decisions based on logical analysis and objective criteria. Whereas those with preferences for feeling, they prefer to make decisions based more on their subjective feelings and values. So when they're making decisions, they strive to maintain harmony within those. And then the final preference pair that we come to is judging and perceiving. And this is all about how people deal with the world around them. So those people with preferences for judging, they strive to reach closure. And in that desire and in that striving to reach closure, we'll often find that they're planful and methodical in their approach. Whereas those with preferences for perceiving, they strive to keep their options open. And as a result of that, you will often see them perhaps being more spontaneous and more emergent in their approach. So once we know our preferences based on these pairings, we gain a 4-letter combination. So for example, Eleanor has preferences for extroversion, for intuition, for thinking, and for perceiving. So her 4-letter type would therefore be ENTP. And we should really emphasize at this point that we can access and do use both sides of the preference pair. The MBTI simply tells us what a person is drawn to. So in other words, what their preferences are. Although we have these preferences, we can all access our non-preferred side. So Caitlin will touch briefly on out of preference scores when talking about Eleanor's profile. And that's because Eleanor has completed the step 2 questionnaire, which explores the facets behind each preference to understand why Eleanor is different to other ENTPs. So Caitlin, could I please ask you to take us through now Eleanor's ENTP profile?
Yeah. So with her preference for extroversion, she gets her energy from other people and tends to have a broad range of interests and a pretty open view on life. And Eleanor struggled with her feeling and thinking preference for a while, not sure which one fit her best, until she realized that she put people at the heart of her decision making. She has a preference for perceiving, and the MBTI step 2 helped her see how while she likes to create and follow procedures and plans, she's also okay with them changing if they're needed to be. And I personally, I feel like those with a preference for ENTP are pretty easy to spot when they're stressed, especially when you're looking back on situations. So you might find Eleanor, for example, suddenly suggesting new processes and formats for marketing collateral or overhauling existing processes. For her boss, this is usually assigned to check in and see how things are going with her. Her boss will often tell her some of the options we already have and some of the processes that are already in place, and maybe we don't need to create new processes, and maybe take a look at what the underlying stressors actually are. And since we started working remotely, it's harder to keep in touch. We're not as connected as usual with our colleagues from around the business, not seeing people every day in the office. And Eleanor's favorite new meeting in this virtual environment is their informal virtual water cooler chat, which is daily check-ins, and as well as the huge virtual all-company meeting that happens once a week. So her initial stress wasn't the change of the location or the marketing plans that we all had to kind of switch with really quick. It was actually a change in how she communicated with her boss. So she couldn't just walk up and chat about her work. Everything now has to move online and it's much more rigid. So she's needing to plan things further out and schedule meetings. She can't just kind of do these things casually.
That's grand. Thanks, Caitlin. So what we're going to do now is move on and look at the 5 scales that emerged from the research. And I mentioned this earlier, but we wrote a number of different questions around what it's like to work in a team. And we wrote these questions from a literature review that I did, and then the scales emerged from the respondents' answers to the questions. So the first scale that we meet is clarity. The next is emotional intelligence. The third, effectiveness. The fourth, stretch. And then finally, the fifth is culture. And what we're going to do is look at each of these 5 scales in turn. So the first scale, clarity. This is all about the alignment and understanding that individuals have to an organisation. So it's about the vision, the mission, the plans and the goals, but it also tells us how much individuals see themselves fitting into that team plan, but also the wider organisational plan as well. But it's also about holding one another to account and developing relationships within the team. So in the question box Caitlin talked you through earlier, we would like to ask you to answer a question. And the question is this: please could you tell us about what and how you see clarity relating to you, your clients, and your stakeholders? So I'm just going to repeat that again. So please could you tell us about how you see clarity relating to you, your clients, or your stakeholders? What we're going to move on to next is having a think about, well, now we know what clarity is, how do we develop clarity? And when we're working remotely, we lose that physical presence with others. And so we can create some physical reminders of who we are and where we're going. So these are just a few ideas. So we cannot be party to informal conversations around business direction. Open plan offices, they're definitely not without their fault, but they can be useful for picking up on bits and pieces of information here and there. I prefer to think of it as a form of socially acceptable eavesdropping. And is it possible to continue or to create a forum where we can ask questions, but also to hear what others are asking to managers and leaders? So regular check-ins are not just about keeping people on track, but they can be also used to check in on people's well-being as well. So meetings are touch points where we can encourage interaction, but also to facilitate networking as well. So Caitlin, please can I return to you and ask you, can you just give us a brief summary of the responses that we have heard to this question?
Yeah, so there's a lot of agreement that it can be hard to maintain clarity right now. A lot of people are saying their companies have switched priorities maybe or focuses. It's harder to know who to check in with and how often with the virtual setting. There's also an increase in meetings on everyone's calendars, and it can be trying to replace the usual passing conversations, but it's definitely getting harder to get things done with the increase in time blocked. And there's also no longer visual cues that someone's available for a quick chat, so people may be more hesitant to ask questions or start a conversation.
That's grand, thank you. I know certainly from my point of view, up until very recently, I worked in a co-located office. I went into the office most days, and for the last couple of weeks I've been working remotely, and it is difficult to not be able to see those visual cues and to notice, and just to kind of get up from my desk and see someone going off to the kitchen and go and grab them for a quick chat. So what we're going to do now is move on to the next scale that emerged from the research around effective teams, and we called this one emotional intelligence. So emotional intelligence, how are we defining this scale? We're saying that it's about the openness that's displayed and wanted. So it relates to how intentional people are in terms of sharing how they're feeling. So I suppose another way of putting it is to say that it's the extent to which people share and show how they're feeling, but also do they invite other people to do the same? So please can I ask you to put in the question box, what do you see as the impact of virtual working on this scale? So in relation to this emotional intelligence scale, what do you see as the impact of virtual working? The next thing that we're going to think about now is extroversion and introversion. So you'll remember that Eleanor had preferences for ENTP. So what happens if we move from the world of ENTP into INTP? Well, when someone's got preferences for introversion, their stress reaction can be to actually move more into the inner world. So they withdraw from the outer world and they move into their inner world. And that might mean that they become maybe a bit quieter. And this is much harder to see in a virtual setting, and we really need to be watching out for stereotyping here. So someone might already be classed as quiet. And people who have got preferences for INTP and ISTP, they're already consider themselves to be quite independent, and under stress this can be accentuated, and they can have a tendency to seek a perfect solution that unlikely exists. So I've got preferences for ISTP. I see this in myself. We've heard about Eleanor, who's already having a harder time working with informal conversations. And I know right now I'm really grateful to my colleagues who have both got preferences for extroversion and introversion, who are reaching out to me. And sometimes I can be so independent that actually I forget to. And I think the other important thing here to remember is that it can be hard for people to ask for support. And if people do ask for support, then there's the risk that people can see that by asking for it, they're somehow admitting some kind of weakness. But actually, when we are working in this different remote style, then actually there's something about cultivating a culture where actually it's okay to reach out and to ask for help and support. So we're just going to carry on and think a bit more about this emotional intelligence scale, and in particular, how can we develop emotional intelligence? So different people want to be involved to a greater or a lesser extent, and some people prefer to remain impersonal and objective, preferring to work independently, maybe preferring to have close relationships with only a few people. On the other hand, you've got some people who want to engage frequently with many others. For example, you might see them seeking out participating in multiple activities. And I think that's what we've heard a bit about from Eleanor already. Now, even when working remotely, some people might find ways of still being visible. And without other people's company, joint decision making, those close relationships that they really enjoy and really crave, without those, then people can feel quite uncomfortable. But at the same time, our needs can be over and under met, and this can be a real source of stress. So I know certainly since we started working virtually in the UK just over 2 weeks ago, I have never had so many remote meetings My cell has never stopped buzzing, and the amount of collaborating that I do has increased exponentially. None of these things are good or are bad. It just comes down to the amount of contact that we want from others. When we move into the virtual world, we lose those opportunities for contact. So it can be harder and people can feel more easily distracted when they're working under pressure. And it's much harder to see what's happening from afar. So Eleanor, we've heard, is very open. She talks about what's on her mind, but some of our colleagues, they might prefer to lead a more personal life. And within that, it's not always possible to ask people what's on their mind, especially in front of a group. So we've talked about that water cooler chat, but actually starting off and asking, so how's everyone doing? Actually, you might not necessarily get such honest responses unless you ask those questions in a one-to-one meeting. And in one of those water cooler meetings, we had a colleague who kind of jokingly said, what happens in lockdown stays in lockdown. And although this was a joke, they were alluding to the fact that this is an unusually stressful time. I know I speak for myself, and I probably speak for many of you when we're probably feeling things that we've never felt before and perhaps unlikely will do again, but that's okay. And when it comes to being a manager, it's not just about being rigorously task focused and enforcing deadlines. It's also about helping other people to find solutions based on their interpersonal needs that we've been talking about. And the key here, I think, is about being flexible. So it's about flexing our style. It's about negotiating around the differences within that. So it's about raising it, it's about acknowledging it, and then it's about asking, what can we do about this? And we need to be honest with one another because we need to keep our machine well oiled. So Caitlin, I'm going to turn to you again. Could you please just share with us about some of the responses that we've heard from our audience?
Yeah, so I definitely see some people talking about how managers are focusing a lot on tasks, which is interesting. And there's a balance kind of issue with social interaction, and then also everybody's kind of had to shift really quickly. And so I know a lot of people are on here saying they're more stressed and they're busier, they feel like. And then some people are commenting that it feels kind of strange to schedule social time. It's almost like a little taboo. And a lot of people are saying that they're a lot less in tune with their teammates' emotional states and stress levels, and it can make it hard to keep the previous relationships strong.
That's great. Thanks, Caitlin. So let's go on. Let's have a look at our effectiveness scale. So what's the effectiveness scale all about? Well, again, what we saw emerging from the data and from the research here is that this scale measured the effective completion of work. So there are a number of questions around this. Is work completed on time? Is it completed on budget? And this scale also measured whether conflict is managed effectively, but also the amount of trust that team members have with one another. So again, in the question box, please could I ask you, what impact is working virtually having on you in relation to this scale? So what impact is virtual working having on you in relation to this scale right now? We're going to move on and we are going to look at ESTJ and ENTJ. And it's interesting just to note here how those with preferences for ESTJ, ENTJ, they might be referred to as directors, but that doesn't necessarily make them senior leaders. So those with preferences for ESTJ, under stress, they can become louder. And there's a risk that when they make decisions, they might be doing so maybe too quickly, or they might be too decisive in their decision making. And so there's something about needing to consider What is this doing for conflict and for trust among the team? So being an effective manager isn't just about getting things done. Being too decisive, closing off options before considering all the information can have negative long-term consequences. And certainly I was working with someone recently, just a couple of days ago, and they were talking about the challenges where they've got organisational policies, they still need to be enforced, but actually how do they take those policies that would normally relate to an office environment and transfer them into the virtual world? And we were talking about actually how do we flex? How do we make decisions where policy is still enforced and upheld, but taking into consideration the fact that right now many people are working in a very different style to maybe what they've been used to. Just going back to effectiveness, how can we go about developing this? What we're looking at is not only just the outputs achieved, but also how well we work together. So when working remotely, it can be really useful to focus on the outputs. So using things like task trackers, where the work delivered can be seen, monitored and evaluated. So it's not just about micromanaging each moment of the day. And this scale does touch on trust, but working remotely does mean that we really need to be trusting one another. And conflict is going to arise, it always does, but one way of managing this is to actually focus on what we've got in common, and this could be at work, a project or a goal, but it could also be from our personal lives, for example, trying to homeschool your kids while also working. And also think about how you deal with conflict. Do you deal with conflict? So not all conflict is bad. Differences of opinion can lead to questioning and debate and disagreeing with one another. Constructively challenging your colleagues can actually be a source of growth. So as I said, this scale is not just about completing time on work and on budget. There is something also about communication in here. And so this could be a time to think about establishing or re-evaluating communication norms. For example, should instant messaging be used for urgent issues or email? What role are WhatsApp group and informal communication networks playing? And also think about how you're following up on tasks here. Are you using multiple methods or channels? So maybe your colleagues are feeling bombarded. A practical way to think about this is to think about the communication methods. So that might mean, for example, a really simple idea is signposting, whether something is for information or for action or for urgent response. And you can simply do that in the subject line of an email. So Caitlin, back over to you. Can you just give us a summary of the responses that we've heard from our listeners?
Yeah, so we did get a response, a few, about the to-do list and feeling maybe like people are being micromanaged, or managers feeling like they are micromanaging when they're trying to check in on progress. And it's harder to see the effectiveness of remote workers because you can't really just like go over and nudge them and check in. It feels a lot more formal. It's not as casual as it was in person. A lot of people are talking about the small spaces that they're in, working at home with kids and homeschooling, family, and dogs, and how that's a lot harder on everyone, as well as some people are having some problems with being effective when the goals keep changing on them. And people also mentioned missing the interaction about decision making and why decisions are being made the way that they are, and lacking visibility maybe with leadership and other stakeholders.
That's great. Thanks, Caitlin. So let's talk about stretch now. So this is the fourth of the team scales. Stretch is about people reporting that their roles help them to develop, that personal development is available, there are opportunities to experiment, participate, and to voice opinions. So how can we think about then developing stretch? One way of thinking about this is actually experimenting with different projects. So this could be around recognizing that different projects maybe require different things in different circumstances. So taking this time to embrace the diversity within teams, and you might see different strengths in different people. So be thinking about what different projects people can get involved with outside of their typical remit. And in meetings, it can be a real challenge for everyone to be heard. And what you might find is that, or indeed what you might know, is that louder voices can often dominate. So be thinking about, how do people contribute? Are people listening to talk, or are they talking to listen? I'm just going to repeat that. The first time I heard it, I was like, wow, this is really powerful. So are people talking to listen, or are they listening to talk? Because being heard and being truly listened to is incredibly liberating. I've experienced this myself, but I've also seen it in others, and there's a variety of ways that this can be implemented. So one practical idea is to give each person time on the agenda. Why? Well, because it can help with increasing collaboration. So try preparing the meeting agenda in advance, maybe 1 or 2 people bringing a problem, a challenge, something they want input on from their team. And then everyone in the meeting contributes, they give their advice from their own unique perspective, and making sure everyone gives their full attention is such a skill. So one way that we can do this is just keep everyone on their toes by asking someone just to summarize the discussion periodically. And this can be a really great way of ensuring that colleagues are giving one another their full attention. Now, the final scale that we come to, culture, this is about the degree of cultural awareness, but also about people saying that they respect and they appreciate one another. And this is really focusing on those cultural nuances, and really kind of bringing those to the fore and seeing those as something that can help benefit a team to grow and to develop. So how can we go about doing this? Well, I would say to begin with, it's just about naming those differences. Many people will say that they flex and adapt their style, but explore examples of when they're doing this. And doing that can just help provide some clarity of thought. And we can broaden this out beyond international cultures, but also think about organizational cultures as well. For example, some people might be working in their second, third, or even fourth language in the workplace. And there are many differences around cultural perception. So for example, what early looks like to one person might be considered late to another. So there are some practical suggestions here, like taking breaks when on conference calls, acknowledging when people are working in different time zones, double checking emails when just before we send them, because humour can be misinterpreted, but also thinking about other ways that this can be developed, actually asking, why have we always done something a particular way, and how is this being informed by our organisational culture? And really thinking about the factors that lead into this. Is it to do with fear? Is it to do with losing face? So what might be the alternative ways that make this more effective? So we're just going to carry on, and we're going to talk about the responses that we heard in relation to what makes an effective team. And here we asked the question, what are the top 3 things that you think make an effective team? And from top to bottom, we see the percentage of references that were made to these characteristics. So communication was one that was mentioned the most, and then trust, then teamwork, and so on and so forth. And our personality and our interpersonal needs will determine how we approach all of these different areas. Each individual and each team is unique, but also they're similar in a multitude of ways. We're just going to focus on communication for a moment, but what I will say is that it's really important that we find our own way through this. We've given you a variety of tips, but the challenge is to integrate them. So most importantly, they need to work for your people, for your culture. One size does not fit all. So just going on and having a bit of a deep dive into communication, As I said, we asked people, what are the top 3 things that you think make an effective team? And what came out really was that we need to flex our communication style. What suits one person might not suit another, and so we need to be constantly re-evaluating. The COVID-19 virus has accelerated the pace at which teams are having to think about communication, so what worked in the past might not be so effective now. Do your team need to meet more often but with shorter meetings, or do your team need to meet less often but with longer meetings? Each individual and each manager is going to have different preferences around this. And within our survey, respondents referenced all of these types of meetings, and they will likely also represent the variety of views within your own organisations or the teams that you work with. So someone with preferences for ENTP, well, from what we've heard Caitlin describing of Eleanor, we would work on the basis that they're likely to prefer informal, ad hoc, unstructured meetings. But even we heard Caitlin's description of Eleanor saying that it's not always practical for the majority of meetings to be structured or unstructured. So everyone can get something out of any kind of meeting, regardless whether it's co-located or whether it's in a remote environment. What we really need to be remembering is that when we're working remotely, we can lose the hustle and bustle of an office environment. And within this, fear can grow in this space. It's worth just kind of reiterating the fact that we're living in uncertain times, and we can mitigate this through trust and communication. And I certainly speak for myself here. When there is silence, people assume the worst. So be transparent. People might be looking to you for answers that you don't have. So be honest about what you do and what you don't know. And if you don't know something, then send a holding message saying, I don't know, but I will come back to you. So the next part of the research then looked at team challenges. The team challenges, again, are listed from top to bottom in terms of the frequency with which we saw people responding. And again, personality transcends all of these areas. So different personalities will approach each of these in a different way. When we're looking at this, every team is going to be different. And going back just to communication for a moment, finding your own way and integrating them into your work and into your culture. And there's something when we look at these team challenges about the fact that they're interdependent. So poor management might not necessarily be in position or in relation to an unmanageable workload. Poor management, maybe poor line management, might actually be stemming from poor leadership. So there's something about thinking about the big picture and thinking holistically in that way. Now, in terms of carrying on with our research, we said that we would look at these in relation to FIRO and also in relation to the MBTI. So the first scale that we are going to look at here is effectiveness. And so what did we find here? Well, for the eagle-eyed among you, you might be looking at the y-axis on this graph and asking, what are these numbers? They're T-scores. So here, what we see are that virtual managers reported higher on the effectiveness scale. So in other words, what they said was that they completed their work on time and within budget, and that conflict was managed and that there was trust within the team. Now, often, as is the case with research, as I said earlier, there are more questions than there are answers. And what we don't know is whether virtual managers are choosing to self-select and to work remotely. But also, there could be some other things going on. For example, might it be that the work that they do involves complex tasks and projects that might actually be suited to a virtual environment? But maybe also, does working remotely mean that virtual managers have to deal with less politics and conflict? So there could be a multitude of things going on here. And moving on and looking at how these scales related to the FIRO results. Well, here we see emotional intelligence, and what we found in relation to the FIRO was that those who reported high expressed involvement also reported higher scores on emotional intelligence. So I'm just going to whiz through, and I said that that's in relation to expressed involvement. The same actually relates to expressed and wanted connection as well. And when we thought about, well, why might this be? Well, that's because when people have got higher scores for inclusion and for involvement and for connection, there can be that desire to invite others to participate and to interact. So that would make sense, that kind of trying to bring other people along on board with them, trying to find out what's going on for people, and asking loads of different questions actually would seem to relate to that emotional intelligence scale. So let's move on and just think briefly around interpersonal needs. And I think the challenge when it comes to interpersonal needs is that whenever anyone completes a questionnaire or whenever anyone completes a survey, they're telling us that they're demonstrating a particular behaviour, but just because they're saying they did doesn't necessarily mean that they did. Self-deception is real, and one way to overcome this can be to seek feedback, as it can help us to develop self-awareness in this way. Let's carry on. Let's have a look at MBTI and how the results came out from the research. So here, in relation still with the emotional intelligence scale, what we're seeing here is that people who have got preferences for extroversion and feeling report higher on the emotional intelligence scale. And just a quick reminder, really, we cannot make inferences about how effective people are in terms of using these behaviours. But if you know your preferences, what I would suggest is that you use this as an opportunity to reflect or ask for feedback on whether you might be over or under using the behaviours associated with this scale. So for example, are you being over open or are you being under open? How many questions do you ask about other people? Might others be finding this intrusive, or might they welcome the opportunity to talk about themselves? So finally, in relation to our MBTI results, we looked at the scale effectiveness. And effectiveness was about respondents saying that they completed their work on time, within budget, and that conflict was managed. And here we see people with preferences for extroversion, they scored higher on this scale. And I know I've said this before, but just because someone says that they deal with conflict, actually do they deal with conflict? And disagreeing or challenging your colleagues can be a source of growth. So although effectiveness is about this challenge and it's about this trust, the question, again, if you know your preferences, how do your colleagues find your style when you are working to deadlines and managing costs? So I'm aware that we are coming up to the end of our time together. So just one final piece on considerations and takeaway points. So I am really mindful about the fact that this presentation might have just felt like one huge sales pitch for FIRO and MBTI, but that's certainly not my intention. It's possible just to use good old-fashioned communication, talk to people about how they feel, and recognise that everyone feels different. The solutions that work for you might not necessarily be the ones that work for your team. Personality assessments are certainly the quickest and the easiest way to get started. And as we've seen from what Caitlin has shared about Eleanor, there are loads of different factors at play that make up how a person thinks and feels. And the final point that I want to mention before I hand back to Caitlin is that this won't be forever. You might feel like by the time you've got the hang of virtual working, we'll all be back in the office. But the truth is, I would say that we still need to be using and flexing and adapting our behaviours to help boost team performance. So Caitlin, back over to you.
Thank you. So yes, we are quickly coming up on the end of our time, but I just wanted to take a second to highlight our new offering, Developing Your Virtual Workforce. So if you visit themyersbriggs.com/go-virtual, we have quite a lot of resources on here. So we've brought forward some product releases, developed new virtual offerings, and we have some free tips as well and free resources. So there's also a contact us form at the bottom of this page, and you can let us know if there's something that you want help with that's custom for you. So that's absolutely what we're here for. So we're in this together and we're here to help where we can. Please talk to us about your current challenges, and we'd love to hear from you and help you meet your goals during this time, during all times, but especially during this time. And unfortunately, we're out of time for questions, but like I said before, we'll definitely follow up with those of you who submitted questions. If you didn't submit a question and you have a question, feel free to submit it now or send us an email, and we will get back to you. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and have a great day.